Okay, we are ready. Go.
Okay. Good evening, dear Círculo Lovecraftiano y Horror friends. Welcome to our weekly session. Tonight is Friday the 13th, and we couldn't let this creepy day to go by without something special. So we have a special guest, one of the modern masters of horror in literature, and it's my personal honor to present you Mr. Paul Tremblay. Paul is the author specializing in horror, sci-fi, dark fantasy. He's an editor, he's a teacher, a math teacher too, as we have here in the gossip world, and he currently lives in New England with his family. Paul, welcome to Mexico. Thank you for being here.
So thank you so much. Honored to be here. Geez, except for Friday the 13th, we should probably have Stephen Graham Jones here instead. Like Friday the 13th is really Stephen Graham Jones's day, but I'm happy to be here in his stead.
Well, you are one of the, let's say, the ones who continue with this tradition, the ones who keep alive the traditions of Halloween, Friday the 13th, all these special dates that we the freaks, with the creeps love. And I would like to start maybe with a question. How are you coping with this pandemic in the writing, in the horror real life world?
Yeah, so I mean, like everybody else in the world, it's been a strange time. I will say, like, when things first got bad in my area, which was mid-March of 2020, in the United States, like my area around Boston was really one of the first places that was hit hard. One of the first areas to go into quarantine, in the US. So yeah, for those first 2 weeks, I usually get asked, oh, because you're a horror writer, you're probably mentally prepared for something like this. I was like, no, I was not the least bit mentally prepared. I mean, I spent so much time thinking about worst case scenarios when being confronted with one. Yeah, no, it didn't help me. And actually for the rest of March and even into April, it was like most people, I just had a hard time, not thinking about anything else about what was going on. And I was supposed to be writing and I was supposed to be reading, and I had a hard time concentrating on anything. And actually what helped me was I went and reread Peter Straub's The Throat. If anyone's ever read Peter, he's one of my favorite writers. The Throat is hardly like a comfort book, but, being able to read Peter's, amazing prose, it was, I don't want to say it was a comfort, but it helped remind me like who I was, right? I tell people, since March of last year, I sort of figured out that I don't read to escape. I read to be me. I mean, that's a big part of who I am. So that was like the first sort of way to inch back into trying to get some, if not normalcy, but at least a part of myself. And then, slowly I started writing. And one of the nice things was, I sort of had to write like that. My agent was ready to pitch a new book to my editor, and like he was able to get a new deal. So I'm like, okay, I have a deadline now, so I have to do this, which was nice. Which was nice to have to actually force me to write when, a lot of days I probably just wanted to sit in the couch and watch like Animal Planet or something to shut my brain off. But yeah, I managed to write a book though in the last year. It's really weird. We'll see how it goes.
We've seen that you are, well, lately there's a lot of of buzz about growing things and stuff like that. I mean, I guess if you are being confined, everybody's been confined, obviously, but has it been an opportunity maybe to reach other audiences with promoting the book, with promoting your work?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I do think, typically pre-pandemic, like author events would all be in person pretty much. And it was pretty rare to have online events, which have now become sort of the everyday thing. Right. So, I do think, hopefully we get to the point where we can do live events again, but, I think it would be beneficial to have a mix of, you can do some live events locally, but then you get to do online events internationally, or even just other parts of the country that I typically don't get to. So that has, that part has been, I've enjoyed that part of it, as much as it can be sort of, I don't know how you all feel, but I get more nervous before I go onto Zoom than I did ever like going, before like sort of a live crowd. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm a math teacher and I'm used to standing in front of people who don't necessarily want to hear me speak. And we're with the book stuff. I'm like, no, they're actually here to hear me speak. So that's, less pressure. But yeah, and in terms of reaching people, it's hard to say. I don't know. Like the book that came out last summer, Survivor Song, is sort of a outbreak book. So I felt like a little guilty having written it in a weird way because I didn't want to read anything about pandemics or virus outbreaks, and here I am, I wrote this book and I have to like promote it and stuff. So that was really weird last summer for sure.
Well, yeah, actually, now that you talk about that, and you were talking about the sad times that we're living, we have had many important books about the influenza. We live those times. Well, not us, or maybe
Sure.
our grandparents or great grandparents. People lived the plague. We had never lived something this bad. Even the last influenza 10 years ago or 12 years ago, it wasn't this really bad. And now that we are living it worldwide, is kind of scary. And you say maybe you want to shoot down watching Disney Channel, Discovery Channel, whatever. Like, and it's something weird to say coming from when you read your books, or when we read your books, like this guy must be having a great time. This is something I write about, this pandemic, but everybody's different. Remember, everyone here in the chat and in the session, it's an open microphone. If anyone wants to ask something, any question, Paul Tremblay is here for everybody.
Yeah, if I don't get questions, I'm going to start giving math questions, and you don't want that.
Hi, Paul. I have a question about your, I believe it's your last novel, The Cabin at the End of the World.
Okay, yeah.
I enjoyed that
Thank you.
novel, but I believe that you have accomplished something very difficult, that in a way to imply to use a child voice, a child narrator, the point of view of the young Wen, this Chinese girl in the middle of nowhere, in some place in North America. I believe that it's very difficult to achieve that, to achieve that point of view of a child in an apocalyptic tale like is the novel. And I don't want to elaborate more because of spoilers, but it was difficult to achieve that point of view, that voice, a narrator voice, as a writer. Was a challenge for you?
Well, first, thank you. And yeah, certainly it's always a challenge. Although I would say weirdly, I feel, or I have felt in the past, comfortable writing kids or writing from kids' point of view. And honestly, I don't know if it's because, I'm around kids all the time. I have 2 kids of my own, and I teach high school math. So I've never left what I like to call the kids calendar. Like in my area, school usually gets out in June, and I'm like, just like every kid, I'm super happy when school gets out. And then when September rolls around, I'm like totally depressed. So I've always been on that sort of kid rhythm. I feel like, and I don't know, I feel like even though as I get older, I'm losing specific memories of things when I was younger, but I feel like I have a vivid memory of the emotional life of a child. And I think just, anyone who's writing kids, I mean, obviously their voice is going to sound different. They're not going to have the vocabulary we have, but that doesn't mean that their sort of interior life or the emotions that they feel are any less sort of vibrant or vivid or even adult-like in some ways. So, I really tried to approach when, knowing that, her emotional language wouldn't necessarily, be up to par with an adult's emotional language, but, she's going to have all these complex feelings and thoughts. And I wanted to try to get that to come through in the story. So thank you. Yeah. I mean, it was certainly, a challenge to write any character, but when was for sure.
And the other question that I have about this novel, The Cabin at the End of the War, is some quality of your prose. In some moments, the prose that you accomplish is so much poetic, but it's a different kind of poetry. It's like a rhythmic, almost mesmerizing read. It's a rhythmic prose. That was deliberately for you. It was all planned, or it was part of the fury and the glory of being writing and achieve that almost magically.
Well, thank you again. I'd say maybe it's a combination of both. I mean, on one hand, every story, everything you write, like at some point, you let intuition lead you. And I love the phrase, and maybe, John Langan, when he was here before, talked about the idea of learning to trust your subconscious, which is something that, it's easier said than done. But I will say for that novel in particular, even though it's a fairly short novel, I spent a long time writing it, and I don't know, normally I will write maybe 500 words a day. That's my goal. About 500 words. And I always edit what I write the day before, or even sometimes the whole chapter before I move on. With Cabin at the End of the World, I moved a lot slower. I think it was probably more like, 300 words as opposed to 500. And I think part of it was I was really sort of concentrating on, the rhythm of the prose. I do a lot of reading out loud too. Although the hard part, sometimes it's a trap there too, because not all fiction's meant to be read out loud. So I'm not necessarily reading it out loud to see what it sounds like if I was reading to an audience. I guess I'm reading it more out loud, for hopefully a consistent rhythm within the story. I haven't read a ton of writers, help books, but there's one called The Art of Fiction by John Gardner, I think, which was published in the 70s, which is amazing. And he spends a whole couple chapters in the end of the book talking about the rhythm of prose, and he actually has a marking system where he can break it down. That's well over my head, which I'm unable to do, and I kind of just go by ear a little bit for what I think the voice or the interior voice of what the story is. Because this next book that I just finished has a much different rhythm, has a much different voice, and a lot of that's just by feel, what feels right too, though, I would say.
Thank you, Paul.
Sure, thank you.
Hi there. I wanna first say hi to a few people online: Fatima Robles, Sergio Martinez, Rogelio Cesario, and also I want to go back to the question about the kids' point of view that we had before, because on Disappearance at Devil's Rock, you use this voice too, also in A Head Full of Ghosts. I mean, like you said, you are surrounded by kids all the time, and this gives you an insight that most won't have, because when I was reading the book, I could feel this despair, this lack of understanding of the kids not getting the adults' decisions or what they're doing, and it's very immersive, and I even remember childhood moments, and it's really cool how you can make these kids have a voice. So I really love that. I also hated the way they talk, and I didn't understand when they talk between themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that was very realistic at some point.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I've had people say, those, 8th grade kids or 13-year-olds are really annoying. I'm like, yeah, 13-year-old boys are really annoying. So I know as a teacher, it's always when I'm at school, every year it's a lesson in voice, because I teach at a very small school. So most of the kids, even in the lower grades, know the upper kids. And what tends to happen is the school almost gets its own slang. to go along with like a very regional slang. So yeah, like in Disappearance of Devil's Rock, when they're talking about like hardo and chirps and stuff like that, that's all stuff I took from the kids at my school. And for me, it's kind of fun. It's a lesson in listening to voice, because like, 3 or 4 years later, the older kids are now gone and the younger kids are now older. They'll come up with different words to mean sort of the same thing that they were talking about 3 or 4 years ago. So I don't know. I mean, for me, like just to observe it, it's kind of neat. Like in Survivor Song, a little bit of a spoiler, but in Survivor Song, a couple of the teens from Disappearance of Devil's Rock come back, and they're now like 17 or 18, and their sort of slang is a little bit different than when it was at Disappearance of Devil's Rock. But again, all stolen from either my own kids or from the kids at school.
Wow, thank you. And
sure.
And also we have some questions from the public.
Okay.
Rogelio asked that he wants to know what you watch in your childhood that make you feel fear, and also what makes you become a writer.
So the first one's sort of easier to answer. I mean, I was and still am like a card-carrying scaredy cat, like afraid of everything. But when I was really young, like 7 or 8 years old, in the Boston area, there was a program on the weekends called Creature Double Feature. So on Saturday afternoons, the first movie would be Godzilla or Rodan. And then the second movie was, so this was early 80s, I guess. So the second movie was more of a straightforward horror movie, maybe a Hammer horror film or something like that. So I came for the big monsters. Like that was sort of my gateway into horror. Was I love dinosaurs as a kid. So I was like, oh, Godzilla's like a big dinosaur. And then the next movies would just scare the crap out of me, like, and give me nightmares, even silly stuff like Attack of the Killer Shrews, which is such a terrible movie, but I would have nightmares about killer shrews. So I've always had like this weird, like love, but also fear attraction to horror. I mean, horror movies still, some of them will really bother me. And, I know there are some that I probably can't watch either. But that's okay. And I still, if it's like a dark basement, I kind of have to run up the stairs quickly. If I'm home alone, the noises in the house still sort of freak me out. I don't know. I would hope that that's like an advantage as a writer, because, I'm definitely not jaded. Like I know you probably have friends or hear people say, oh, I've seen so many horror movies, nothing scares me. Like, how's that possible? I don't entirely believe those people either. I'm like, you're probably just not watching the right or the good movies. The second question, how I became a writer, it's really hard to answer. I'm not sure why, honestly, because when I was growing up, I wasn't a big reader as a kid. Like I came home and watched TV, or I would be in my backyard by myself, just shooting playing basketball by myself in my backyard. We had this old beat up basketball net in my backyard. And then, when I went to college, it was for mathematics. And then sort of after college, I went to graduate school for math. And while I was there, my girlfriend, who's now my wife, she bought me Stephen King's The Stand for my 22nd birthday. I was like, oh my gosh, this is great. So while I was struggling to get my master's in math, I read Stephen King, and then, from Dance Macabre, I found Clive Barker and Shirley Jackson and Peter Straub and so many more. So at the end of those 2 years, I had this weird itch to want to try writing a story. It was really sort of inexplicable to me because I'd never studied writing, had no idea what the hell I was doing. I guess I had a want for some creative outlet. I was also messing around with playing guitar as well. Like, honestly, if I had a time machine and if I could still choose, like, hey, you could do it again and you could be like a semi-famous punk rock musician, I think I would choose that. So a frustrated musician at heart, but yeah, I don't know. I just, I started writing stories and just sort of like stubbornly stuck with it. And it took a really long time. Like I started writing, not seriously, but in the mid to late 90s, I wrote my first stories. It was very much a hobby then, but I would send them out to magazines and get rejections. But then eventually, like, the rejections stopped being form rejections. They're like, hey, this is pretty good, but this is why I don't like it. And I started getting feedback, and I just kept trying and trying. into the 2000s, and just sort of stubbornly kept banging my head on it until I got better and people started publishing my stuff. That was a really long answer. Sorry.
Cuervo, you were going to ask something?
Yeah, I have a question regarding the theme of fear. You talk about what things may give you the goosebumps or scare you when you were a kid, and you talk about giant monsters or the killer shrews or the Hammer movies. But as time passes and we grow, fears change. But my question is more about, do you think as a writer that the fear, the horror or the terror is changing or evolving as mankind, as our countries experience different stages of history, or there is some topic that are universal and will stay with us forever? Like you talk about the devil or you talk about exorcism, but I remember this scene about this wild nature, cosmic feeling of the green area surrounding, giving us this sense of discomfort. So I think that I related that with the fear of the environment, revenge. I don't know. Maybe you can talk about this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so like for me, there definitely was like a hard line of demarcation for when kid fears sort of became more adult fears. So again, when I was younger, it was like anything supernatural, would scare the crap out of me. But, growing up as a teenager in the 1980s, my biggest fear was dying in a nuclear war. And that was like, okay, those were my first sort of adult fears. Those weren't like the fun fears of a werewolf, etc. And I think that has come out, like, as I've gotten older, those nuclear war fears have sort of morphed more into, fears of seeing the end of the world from any sort of various possible way that, everything could break down. And I wrote about that a lot, actually, or wrote it in my early writing. So many of my short stories were sort of either apocalyptic or I don't want to say post-apocalyptic. I would even say like in the middle of an apocalypse, but they were always like quiet stories, sort of about like, what would these, this, little set of 4 people, what are they going to do as, some big global event now is sort of destroying everything. So those are things that, sort of scare me now and have for a while. I mean, the nuclear war thing still terrifies me though, like to the point where I haven't never really written about it, and I can't watch stuff or read stuff featuring, nuclear war. Like, I've never read, I like Cormac McCarthy, but I never have and never will read The Road, or, things like that. So yeah, I don't know. I think I answered the question. I hope I did without being too much of a bummer.
Actually, I tell you that Abraham Cuervo Oscuro, he's an engineer and he's a conservationist. He loves nature. I always have this clash with him. What is your opinion as a teacher, as a father? Do we have any hope? Is anything gonna get better? Like it's maybe a solar punk future waiting for humanity, or we are doomed?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, I have no idea. I would like to think there's hope. Things are going to change and they're going to be really bad for a lot of people. But, so I don't know, like people adapt. I mean, I think it's harder to destroy civilization than people think, short of, asteroids or nuclear bombs. I mean, there's going to be people who go on, there are going to be people who adapt. It's just going to be, what's that going to look like? And obviously none of us know. But yeah, no, it's certainly, and, I used to take sort of comfort in the idea that, every generation has been preoccupied with, apocalypse. Like you can go back and read apocalyptic fiction from the 1890s, but, it certainly feels more of the moment, with good, for good reason, but also because, we're just so saturated with the images of portent and doom. It's hard not to just like cycle through those fears. I recently did an interview with Chuck Wendig. I don't know if you've read his fiction, but he has a new book out now called the Book of Accidents. Yeah, but he talked about like in the US and, the 1920s, the Dust Bowl was an apocalypse in the middle of America. And, people adapted, people sort of got through it. Now that's probably going to be small scale compared to what we're going to have to deal with. But yeah, so I don't know. We'll see. I mean, I remain mostly because of the newer generation, seeing what they're willing to do, willing to stand up for, and the work that they're willing to do sort of gives me hope.
That's great. Let's hope we have hope.
Yes.
Paco, your turn.
Hi, Paul. I just want to know a little bit about your writing process. You talked about writing 500 words per day and editing your previous day's work. And my question is about your full process. Do you plan your plots or your novels, or what do you do before starting writing your first chapter? Or do you just sit down and start writing? What's the full process? Do you envision your whole novel and then start writing, or can you talk a little bit about how you do it? How long does it take you, like in your mind, like say, hey, I'm gonna write a book and it should take me this long, or I mean, I'm not gonna wait 5 years until I finish. Just tell us a little about your process.
Yeah, absolutely. I was looking this way to see if there was any of my notebooks within reach. We'll see here. That's not a good one though. I've got like 10 or 12 of these, usually smaller ones like this. So typically, for short stories, I don't do a lot of planning. Like I usually, and for most story ideas, even the novels, typically what I have at the beginning is the end and a rough idea of, typically what I have is the beginning and a rough idea of what the end is going to be. So for me, it's always been trying to figure out how do I get from A to Z. So I guess I'm up to 9 novels now. Is that true? I think so. I've probably 2/3 of the time I've actually written an outline first, a plot outline. So typically what I'll do is, I'll take one of my notebooks. I'm looking for a good notebook. Where is it? Hold on. Man, I wish I was more organized. Okay, I'll show you this one. I have a couple. So typically what I do in the beginning, if it's a novel, because I've been very, I'm happy to say I've been in the position where I've had a contract for a novel due, and I've had to figure out what that book is going to be. I wish I was a writer who had like a backlog of stories just waiting in my head. Like, okay, this year I'm going to work on this one. Every time I feel like I'm starting over from scratch. I don't keep like all these different stories ready to go. I'm trying to come up with one when it's time to write one. Anyway, so typically what I'll do is I'll jot down some early ideas into a notebook. And let's see, I don't know if you can see this or not. Oh, the light's too bright. This is the first page of eventually what became A Head Full of Ghosts. I just sort of had like a random idea. And then I worked my way to, okay, it's two sisters. And then this was like the next page where with A Head Full of Ghosts, I was sort of lucky. I sort of knew right away there was going to be, I knew what the story was. I knew what the frame was. And I didn't write a outline for Head Full of Ghosts, but most of my others I have. So typically what I'll do is I'll try to just work out in the notebook, okay, what's going to happen. And then I will type, I aim for about 10 to 12 pages of this is what happens, like just to have a roadmap for the novel. And every book's been different, like Disappearance of Devil's Rock. I spent a long time trying to come up with an outline. And even at a certain point, I just gave up on the outline. So now I'll try to figure it out at one point in the book. Cabin at the End of the World, I probably really only summarized like 2/3 of the book and did a lot of hand waving by the time I got to it. But I do find, for me, plotting is the hardest part. Like I feel much more comfortable with voice, character, maybe even atmosphere or the feel of the book. And for me, the plot part of it is the challenge, and partly because as a reader, I tend to be more interested in the voice and the character and sort of the things that, I feel like I'm good at as a writer. So for me, like the outlining process probably can take, 2 weeks to like a month. I sort of leave that amount of time for myself to do that before I start writing chapter 1. And then from there, it's been usually about 12 to 15 months. Again, depending on, the deadline structure of, of what I have, in one of my contracts. Once I actually do write, it's all on the laptop. Like I wish I could write longhand like John Langan does, but I can't. I have to write on a laptop because I need to cut and move things around. I'm not as smart as John. And yeah, so I mentioned, I aim for like 500 words a day, but I don't beat myself up if I don't make that every day. So I kind of look forward to like a little bit more realistically, okay, 500 a day. If I can get, because I'll probably miss a couple of days maybe because stuff comes up. If I can get like 2,000 to 2,500 a week. And then if I can get in the early going, typically it's like, if I can get 10 to 12,000 words in a month, that's great. And then, try to build up maybe from there. But for me, like I found those goals, especially if they are manageable, are helpful. Because I feel good if I make my monthly quota. That's a good feeling. Even if I miss a day or two here, just any sort of ways to make me feel good about the process. Because like almost every other writer out there, as I'm writing it, I'm doubting myself, feeling terrible, thinking it's terrible. The part I'm addicted to is having a completed book. To me, that's like, that's the drug. That's what I'm addicted to is, okay, I have this thing. I want people to read it.
Don't throw those things in the trash because in 100 years, people are gonna go to auctions and gonna be on like, we have this sketchbook from A Head Full of Ghosts.
Right.
Paul Tremblay.
In 100 years, when the cockroach human hybrids are picking through our trash, they'll find it.
We're gonna go with Morgan again. We have a few comments from the audience.
Thank you, Paul, for your answer.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Well, we have a question from Jose Talamantes. First, he said he liked the stories at Growing Things because the thematic is different in each story. And then he asked about your process, which you already answered. So we're gonna skip that and go to the next question.
Sure.
And he asked, what kind of music do you listen to while you write? And if you feel that your words are influenced by the sound around you.
Yeah, so I would say like I definitely go looking for a musical influence because, as I mentioned before, sort of a frustrated musician at heart, music was my first love. In terms of art, like I say, music probably even before film and writing. But when I'm writing, I can't listen to anything with lyrics. I get too distracted by the lyrics. So it has to be instrumental or very close to being instrumental. Like I wrote a lot of Disappearance at Devil's Rock to a Swans record called Seer. It was very sort of dark. And even like the title Seer was sort of what, one of the characters called himself a seer, etc. So yeah, I definitely go looking for that. I listen to a lot of movie soundtracks. So with A Head Full of Ghosts, it was mostly Ravenous, the 1999 movie, which is a really fun, quirky soundtrack. It's kind of hard to find now. So it's Ravenous. There's a band called Mogwai that has like a 30-minute instrumental that I use a lot. Bela Bartok writes some of the really heavy, creepy strings stuff. I tend to listen to those. Lately, I've been listening to Mark Corvin, who was the composer for The Witch and The Lighthouse. So I listen to those two quite frequently. I used to prefer silence, but I've had to go to music so often just because, I don't know if you can tell, like those are curtains. That's not a wall. My house can be loud. But I still have to write. Or if I'm elsewhere, like with just my laptop and I need to drown out the noise, then I have to go to music. So I think I've inadvertently trained myself to to need music now to write, which is kind of weird, but as long as it works, I'm okay.
Thank you for your answer. And
Sure.
we also want to say hello to Hector Muñoz and Francisco M. Juarez. And we have another question from Gerardo Lima. He says, hi, Paul. I would like to ask you about contemporary horror. I heard Lair Barron talking about new golden horror era. Do you think the same about the contemporary writers, themes, sets, or plots? Does this golden era include some Latin American writers? It's a pleasure to hear you.
Well, thank you. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, with the caveat that, I think every writer who's ever lived probably thought, oh, I'm working in the golden era of whatever I'm doing right now. But I think the evidence is pretty compelling that we are in a golden age of horror writing, whether it's film or, and including literature. Just in terms of, horror still has a long way to go in terms of diversity of voice, but it's certainly more diverse than it ever has been. And hopefully that, and that will continue for sure. As far as Latin American writers go, one of my favorite writers is Mariana Enriquez. So in the US, we've had 2 short story collections published of hers. One is, Things We Lost in the Fire, which to me is my favorite short story collection of the 20th century. Just blew me away. It's terrible. I'm terrible with titles, but she had a new collection come out in the past year that was wonderful as well. And I'm eagerly awaiting, I think it'll be out next year. I'm hopeful I might even have an early ARC copy to read, but like her big 800-page horror novel that she just completed is something that's going to be published in the US as well. On the film side of things, I love Asita Lopez's Tigers Are Not Afraid, Alejandro Brugués. Juan of the Dead is a very funny movie, and he's been doing a lot of like fun horror comedies as well. I'm sure I'm spacing on some other writers as well. But yeah, for sure, those are certainly some of my favorites.
What about the classics? Did you ever read Borges or Jorge Luis Borges or maybe Gabriel Garcia Marquez?
Yeah, a little bit. So, but again, for me, it's like I feel like I've always been playing catch up in terms of reading because I didn't really read much of anything other than what was assigned to me in school. Like I was a good little boy and did the readings that were assigned to me in school. But that's actually one of the things that drives me to as a writer is that I don't come from an English/literature educational background. I wouldn't be so obnoxious to say that I've done it all on my own because I've had help from plenty of people. But I would say I love Roberto Bolaño. Like I want to write the horror version. Well, 2666 is already a horror novel, I think, but I kind of wanted. I had an idea that was going to riff on that, but I'm not good enough to do it yet. So maybe in the future. But he's someone I read frequently. And it's definitely a favorite. And I know people don't necessarily consider him a horror writer, but he slips in some stuff, man. Like there's some moments. I think 2666 is the obvious part where he's recounting all the terrible killings. But there are moments in Savage Detectives too, where he's describing someone coming into an apartment and he's describing it as a horror scene. And I think he's doing it with like a little bit of a wink. But man, and then some of his short stories too. I think he definitely had an interest in horror. I hope it's too bad that we didn't get to see him maybe sort of not. I felt like at times, and this is probably, I haven't read enough to say this, but I think there was somewhat, he had a weird relationship with genre, I think. Other than, what we would just call literary fiction. I would love to have seen him sort of just like, maybe be here now to see all the stuff that's being done with genre. I assume he would probably go whole hog and write this crazy horror novel, but.
You talk about your influences as music, as other writers in your work, but also you are also a mathematician, and does it gives you some kind of ideas, a perception of the way you tell a story, or an idea about this can be something horrible, or this can be something disruptive in our way to perceive the reality. I don't know what. Talk about us that math in your work as a writer.
Yeah, so I mean, if it's there, I think it's there sort of obliquely or sort of under the surface. I mean, I do think maybe my process is a little bit more analytical than most. Like, I wish I could just like get it all out on the page and then revise it. But, you know, I feel like I have to go, you know, and hearing me just talking about word counts, I think that's, you know, a little bit mathy. You know, it's just trying to go in almost like this stringy order. I do think, and how I sort of apply the interior logic of a story, particularly in the books that use ambiguity, like in A Head Full of Ghosts, for example, and also in The Cabinet at the End of the World. I really worked hard to imagine everything that happened in the story having to fit on a scale, like a justice scale, like where if I was building up one side, nothing supernatural was happening, I would have to even it out on the other side. So, I mean, if my sort of training in math / logic helped me with that, like I kind of feel like I almost like in a game of chess where you try to figure out all the moves before you make a move. I'm a terrible chess player, by the way. I'm too much of a poor sport, so I can't deal with that. But like in terms of the story, I kind of feel like I try to anticipate what are all the things that could happen and then try to pick out the best one that fits the story. So like, I know there's a lot of people who really hate the ending, The Cabinet at the End of the World, which is fine. I think it's the best ending it could have had, but because I tried out every other possible ending before I wrote that one in my head.
Super. Paul, I have another question. Maybe this is for trivia night or something, but what is your favorite book and what is your favorite book that you have written and why for each?
Oh, my favorite book. That's so hard to answer because I can't give you one. So so I already mentioned The Stand. I mean, that helped turn me into a reader. I want to mention one short story too. Joyce Carol Oates's "Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been?" When I was in college, one of the last classes I took was an English literature class, but it was like a freshman lit class. And I'll never forget reading that story. Like that was like, oh, I didn't know people wrote things like this. So it was really the Oates story and the King novel that turned me into a reader. A few other favorites, I would say, just based on the number of times I've reread them. Shirley Jackson's "We Have Always Lived in the Castle." I've reread 3 or 4 times. I used to reread Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five every summer. Not quite sure why. For when I was in my 20s and into my early 30s, that was just like this little ritual that I did. And the last one I would mention is House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski, is one of my favorites. I've managed to read that one twice, which is an undertaking. And the favorite book of mine that I've written, I think it's still A Head Full of Ghosts for a number of reasons. One, well, I don't know, I'm very proud of that book. I mean, certainly my career is what it is now because of that book. It was very satisfying to me as a writer. Also, because I had written a couple of crime novels that came out in 2009, 2010 that did not do well at all commercially. And that really threw my ego and head for a loop. And I really spent a couple of years just being kind of bitter and self-pitying and jealous of other writers, which, that's the page killer. That's the mind killer, really, jealousy. And it took me a long time to both like come to grips with those feelings and sort of release them. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the moment I did, really almost within the same time frame, that when I let go of those feelings, or I probably should say I'm more honest in recognizing those feelings, so that to be able to push them aside. But once I did that, A Head Full of Ghosts, like the story just landed in my lap almost like as a reward. And so when I wrote that book, I felt like it was good. And I knew because of my 2 crime novels that didn't sell well, it was going to be hard to sell A Head Full of Ghosts, because in the US, if you have a track record of poor sales, publishers typically don't want to take another chance with you. So I was able to find one editor who wanted it and who wanted to take a chance with it. So, I mean, for all those reasons, just that book being what it is, I think that's my favorite.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for answering that question.
Yeah.
Great answer.
Yes, great answer. And we have another question from Talamantes on YouTube. He asked, are there any trends in horror that you aren't a fan of?
Yeah, well, I kind of hope, like, I mean, whatever I would bring up, there's always a counterexample to something that I do like, so I would want to say that right off the bat. Like, so one's like, it seems like a lot of movies in particular are going toward horror comedy, which is fine. But I don't know, like, to me, my favorite horror movies are horror movies. Like, if a horror story is the idea that in a horror story, you reveal a terrible truth, right? I think every story, any piece of art is revealing some sort of truth. In a horror story, it has to be, a terrible truth. And I don't know, to me, that's like, I don't want to say it's a sacred thing, but, I love that idea of horror revealing something terrible. I actually find, even in the most even in the most sort of depressing, disturbing stories, the reveal of this truth to me is a hopeful thing. Like we were talking about, do we have hope? I think we do, because there's hope and recognition and shared recognition that something is terribly wrong. Those are my favorite horror stories. And I find hope in that even if the characters don't survive, even if we're not going to survive, it's almost like that punk rock, fuck yeah, anyway, we know something's terribly wrong. There's hope in that to me. So like a horror comedy to me undercuts that a little bit. That said, I'm wearing a t-shirt for, American Werewolf in London, which is like one of my favorite movies, and Evil Dead 2 is like one of my favorite movies. So, but those movies I do think are still horror movies though, that still work with that reveal too. I'm not a huge slasher fan either, but again, like, there are some slasher things I like, and, and Stephen Graham Jones's new novel, My Heart is a Chainsaw, is a wonderful book. But like, I have a hard time with the slasher thing. Probably like, I don't know. It's just not my thing. Like, I'm not going to, say this is lesser horror, but like, there are so many horror fans that are like, oh, the body counts. I'm like, I'm less interested in that. I kind of want to, I don't know. I look for something else, I guess. Yeah. As far as other trends, I'm not sure. I'm sure we're going to see a lot of, eco horror, that's going to be hard to watch as we're living through it. I was going to write this before. I'm going to put it in the comment, but I forget why I was thinking of this book. But there's a great nonfiction book called Wasteland by Scott Poole, where he really argues that modern horror sort of grew out of the horrors of World War I. Like he makes this really compelling case about how what would have been written horror like really was changed by that experience. So I think we're going to see sort of the same thing coming out of these few years, hopefully few years with the coronavirus, et cetera. It's hard to know where it's going to go. Like I hope it doesn't I hope it doesn't go into goofy land. Like I want horror to still be horror. We can still, you can have that sort of fun too, but like I don't want to see everything be a comedy horror movie if I haven't put my foot in my mouth somehow.
Okay, well, I want to say hi to Alexander on YouTube, also the Sanctuary Mistress, which is Pamela, and she asked, do you like Buffy the Vampire Slayer?
I have to admit, I've never watched it. I'm terrible. All my friends like make fun of me for not having watched it. I watched X-Files. That was my favorite sort of 90s, horror show. But yeah, I've never seen Buffy. Sorry. So I can't say.
Javo Monzon, the Count of Apodaca.
Hey, Paul, I heard you a couple of times now mention that you like punk music. What kind of punk music do you listen to, or do you say that just as in a manner of punk rock? Yeah, let's do it. what kind of music do you listen to on your free time? And I'd like to know if you still play guitar, you know?
Yeah, I do still play for fun. Yeah, and it is fun. It's a nice release. Like my favorite band of all time is Círculo. So I still listen to a lot of 80s punk, I suppose. But, you know, Círculo / Bob Mould is my go-to. And in fact, the novel that I just finished writing, I wrote a lot about music within the book, because this book is going to be called The Pallbearers Club. And it's really, it's going to be presented as like a faux memoir or a fake memoir about a character who's essentially me, but in an alternate reality. A me that like maybe dropped out of college to be in a punk band. But at the same time, there's this strange woman who is this figure that looms throughout his life, who may or may not be like a supernatural kind of figure. So yeah, I listen to, you know, Círculo, Bob Mould probably the most, but I don't know, like the Buzzcocks. I'm trying to think. I'm so bad when I'm on the spot. I'm gonna have to cheat and look at my phone. What else I've been listening to lately? Yeah, and you know, so I probably branch a little bit into metal too. Like actually, a band called Big Business is really cool. It's just a drummer and a bassist. Both used to be in the Melvins. If you notice, in most of my novels, I typically get a band to give me like a quote in the beginning of the book in the epigraph. So one of my favorites is a band called Future of the Left in England. They used to be a band called McCluskey. They were really big in England. And then Future of the Left, they're sort of like angry, smart British post-punk kind of stuff. For newer punk bands, there's one in San Diego called Neighborhood Brats, which are awesome. You know, and then, you know, half the time I don't even know what I'm listening to. Like I'll just scroll through Bandcamp, and I found this band called Uzi in Colombia. Oh, just great. You know, I have no idea what they're saying, but a really fun band. Yeah.
I must
Great,
say
thank you.
that Javo Monzon, it's our family musician here. He's singer in a great number of bands. They are all amazing. I will send you the link for those bands, because they are
I wouldn't say family, but yeah.
family size. Our beloved Javier Monzon. Okay, Mariana has some questions, but her microphone is it working, Mariana, you ask, or more?
Yes.
Okay.
No, it's just that I'm kind of embrace to speak in English. Thanks, Mr. Paul. So I want to ask a couple of questions. What about cults? We are kind of cultists here because of our circle, but it's kind of a joke. But why are you so afraid about them? Maybe because it's more terrifying. And what is the meaning of horror for you? I mean, if you can describe it or put a definition on that. And as a jury, what are the more popular subjects between writers over there? And those horror writers are well valued between other genres over there in USA?
Let me go with that one first. And I would say no, that, you know, horror is still, it's getting better, I will say, in terms of being taken seriously by sort of mainstream literary reviewers. But it used to be, like, in as short as 10 years ago, I was at a literary festival, the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, which is one of the bigger literary festivals. And I was on a bus from the hotel, and I was sitting next to a poet who had won an award the night before. And we were talking, and I congratulated her on winning the award. And then she said, "Oh, what do you write?" And in my head, I'm like, "Oh, this isn't going to go well." And I even said, like, instead of just saying horror, I said literary horror, to try to, I don't know, dress it up a little bit. And she laughed and then turned to talk to somebody else. I'm like, what? So, I mean, there's still that response, like from other writers, other sort of, you know, literary writers. But like I said, I do think it's being taken more seriously. There's less of a stigma attached to it. That said, like within the academic community of the United States, there are only a few MFA programs, Masters in Fine Arts programs, which will take people who say they write horror. So it's still definitely a thing that is, looked down upon for whatever reason, which, like I fight against it. And like, it's part of the reason why I helped start the Shirley Jackson Awards, is like to try to show that, no, there's really good stuff being made. I fight against it, but also at the same time, I kind of like it to go back to the punk thing. I don't know, horror should be on the outside, I think. Horror should be able to, poke and prod at the mainstream and ask difficult questions. We should be sort of the people that people are afraid of on some level, Let's see. Also, you asked about cults. To me, they're terrifying. One, because they're, human. And, we can have a supernatural cult, obviously, but like anytime where you've got a group of people who not only sort of, succumb to groupthink, but like, I think obviously like we're afraid of cults because, they're acting for not themselves, they're acting for this other thing. But, the idea that, because it's attractive too, right? The idea that you're going to give up your personal responsibility because this cult has this code that you have to behave by. There's an attraction, there's an undeniable attraction to the idea that, oh, I can release the burden of personal responsibility. I can break the compact of society's rules, right? I can break this compact. It's not my fault. I get to do these awful things because I'm a part of this cult. So that was definitely something I was considering when I was writing Cabinet at the End of the World, with the four invaders. Like, they were never really described as a cult, but they were certainly, acting as a group. And, certainly QAnon is, I'm seeing the comments, is the most frightening cult going. In terms of my definition of horror, I feel like I sort of talked around it a little bit earlier by saying, to me, like a horror story is that, there's this reveal of a terrible truth. And once that happens, I think the best horror stories then ask the characters, so what are you going to do now? What decisions are you going to make? Do you know the consequences? How do you live through this? How does anyone live through this? Certainly other genres can tackle those same questions, but I feel like horror is sort of built to really sort of get at those in interesting ways. I will say I would never define horror as the scare. Like anytime, like if there's a horror conversation and someone says, oh, that's not horror because it's not scary, I sort of instantly dismiss that person's opinion, sort of. Because what's scary is so subjective, just like what's funny is so subjective, right? I mean, I think we can intellectualize and say, oh, we know that was supposed to be scary, but what scares you and what scares me are going to be different. So I don't think horror is the scare. Horror is dread. It's, it can be disturbing. It can be all those things that, sort of that we talk about. And that's actually what I try to concentrate on as a writer. I don't sit down and think, okay, what's going to be scary? I try to think, okay, what's going to be disturbing? What's going to move the reader in some way? And then if it scares them, great. But I have no idea if it's scary or not. When I turned in A Head Full of Ghosts to my agent, I thought it was good. I thought it was clever. I had no idea if it was scary or not. I thought people would think it was fun. And when he sent it out, really, this is a very short story. When he sent it out to the first batch of editors, one of the editors called him up at like 11:30 at night, which editors typically don't do. And the editor, he answered the phone and said, hello. And he said, the editor just said, oh, I just read the tongue scene and I had to hear someone's voice. And then she hung up. I was like, yeah, maybe it is scary.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Pepe.
Thank you. Hello, Paul. Let's say a big shot Hollywood producer goes to your house, knocks at your door, and says, hey, we read half of A Head Full of Ghosts, and we want to make a movie, a Netflix movie or something like that. What would it be your conditions to make that kind of art or something like that? Would you pick I want to pick an actress, I want full creative control. What would you ask?
I wish I had that power. Maybe someday. So I've had, some of my books have been what they call optioned. And so when they option something, I don't know if you know this or not, you probably do, but just in case, They're essentially just renting exclusive access to the work for like 18 months. So A Head Full of Ghosts has been optioned since like 2015. It's getting kind of ridiculous. And they've had some close calls. It would have filmed last summer if, the world didn't have a mini apocalypse with with the coronavirus. So, right, I'm seeing the comments, right. Initially Elvis Perkins, not Elvis, that's his brother. Why am I spacing on the guy's first name? This is so terrible. Anyway, Mr. Perkins, the director of The Pretty Thing, that lives in this house. And he also did, oh my God, I'm so terrible tonight with titles. The Black Coat's Daughter, if anyone's seen The Black Coat's Daughter, which is a really cool movie. So anyway, yeah, he was initially assigned to be the director. But then I think, and actually I read his screenplay, which I thought was really cool. It was much different than the book, but which is fine. I think it would have been a cool sort of sibling to the book. But I think Hansel and Gretel not doing so well commercially sort of made the movie people afraid to have him attached to something that was going to cost more money. So then he was out, but now Scott Cooper is attached. Scott Cooper hasn't done a lot of horror stuff, but he has a horror movie coming out called Antlers, I think, later this fall. So I'm not really sure what's going on now with that book. I feel like Cabin at the End of the World might be the closest to filming. I can't say who it is, but it's a pretty famous director has signed on, and if he wants to make it, it'll get made. So in all of those cases, I have no say. Like, with Head Full of Ghosts, no contractual say. With Cabin at the End of the World, I had no contractual say, but the producers like, oh, we want your opinion. And, they sent me screenplays and, I gave them feedback, but nothing contractual. So that's sort of like the goal, hopefully, like maybe, if we sell the Paul Bears Club, we're going to try to get me attached in some way, maybe. Survivor Song has been optioned too, and I would be listed as an associate producer, but in movie land, I think that's like, it's just like a title, like an empty title. So I don't know. I'm definitely interested in exploring more of some of the Hollywood stuff. Maybe to have some control, maybe to try something, maybe as a way to leave teaching. Yeah. Let me tell you,
you will miss it if you leave it.
I would definitely. But I feel like it's getting harder to balance both, because I feel like the demands for both have been sort of steadily increasing, and something's going to have to give at some point. Let me tell you, I have one very funny, obnoxious conversation with a producer once. It was with Cabin at the End of the World. Somehow it got out that there was an announcement that I signed a new book deal. It was going to be this book, The Cabin at the End of the World, home invasion story, blah, blah, blah. And at that point, I'd only written 50 pages in a summary. But, producers started calling. It's like, hey, can we talk to Paul? It's like, it's only 50 pages in a summary, but if you want to talk about it, sure. So the first person they put me on the phone with was a big producer for giant movies. I won't necessarily say, I don't know the producer's name, but he did stuff like Jurassic World. And so right off the bat, I was like, why does he care? Cabin could be filmed for $50,000 in a cabin. It's not Jurassic World. So I get on the phone with this guy, and I'm not exaggerating. This is how the conversation went. I get on the phone and he says, hey, dude, I want to be in the Paul Tremblay business. It's like, oh, what? A couple of minutes later, he's like, I haven't read everything yet. Like, what? It's 50 pages. But I'm good at guessing what's going to happen. There's going to be time travel, right? I'm like, no, there's going to be no time travel. It was such a waste of time. But that's really the only time I've had a useless conversation with producers. Most of them
continued with it is now.
Yeah, right. It is now. Yeah. Most everyone else I've talked to, has read the stuff, and it's been cool. The only weird part with Hollywood, it's everyone comes off as your friend, and now we're totally going to do this, and then you never hear from them again. I'll reference Chuck Wendig one more time. I don't know if he's the originator of this, but he was the one I heard say this. He said in publishing, it's no, 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 no until it's yes. And in Hollywood, it's yes, 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 yes until it's no. I believe I am in More Dark. I'm just reading a question in the chat. Is Paul Tremblay in More Dark? I am. I think I'm in a car with Laird at some point in that story, but I can't remember exactly what part.
I don't know if you have that kind of power in Hollywood, but I can tell you this: you're gonna give some nightmare to a casting director when they cast Mary Barron. I can tell you that.
Yeah, as
That
the
guy's
kid,
gonna
for sure.
gonna have a headache. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
That's such a wonderfully written character, man.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a case of my daughter was the same age as Mary when I was writing the book. And I unashamedly, took a lot of my daughter's mannerisms and used it in Mary, to the point where that was the last book that my wife read of mine that I've written because she was so upset by the book. I'm like, come on, Mary lived. It's okay.
Jesus. We are really getting more dark in here.
Yes, we are.
Caro. Hola, Caro.
Hi, Paul.
Hi.
Thank you for being here today.
Sure.
I have a few questions. Maybe you already answer a bit of what I'm gonna ask, but maybe you could expand.
Sure.
One is, so I hear from different writers, oh, I write for myself, or others oh, maybe I take into account what people say. What do you think? Do you write thinking of how the readers are going to feel, or you just think about what scares you? The other thing is, once you start working in your work, or when you start writing, do you have a standard and say okay, now is Paul Tremblay standard is done at my quality? And if there is something like that, I will be very interested to know okay, I have these 3 things that my book needs to have, or I don't know, maybe not.
Yeah.
And finally, I'm very interested in hearing more about the process of developing characters. How do you do that? I find it very hard, and anything that you could teach me, I'll be highly appreciated. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm looking for my other. Darn. I had another notebook, but it's not within reach, that had some character sketch stuff. But I'll start there first. So typically, if it's a novel in the planning phases, I'll actually even draw little terrible pictures of the characters just to this is what they look like. I'll write down a few characteristics, even if I don't mention it in the story. But honestly, I always think about, how do I know anybody? Think of your friends here in this room. We don't get to hop into other people's heads. At least I don't think Santiago has that power. Maybe he does. But as you go through real life, even your loved ones, you only really know someone by what they do and what they say. So that's the thing that rings through my head as a writer. Okay, if I'm going to build characters, they're really only going to be who they are because of what they do and what they say. Especially, when I first started writing, I loved first person, partly because, maybe it felt easier to me for some reason. But for me, that was a great lesson in building the other characters because I couldn't hop into their heads. And even when I go third person, I never do third person omniscience. I probably should at some point because that would be a real challenge for me. So I don't know. Those are the things I really sort of concentrate on. And Caro, I steal from everybody I know, for characters. And that's helpful to me. But it's fun for me. By the end, they become someone else. I know it might be a little bit weird for my friends and family when they recognize bits of themselves in characters, but I never think of them that way. They become their own things. So yeah, don't be afraid to, if you're not sure, to start with someone, because the character you start with is oftentimes going to end up maybe changing the story in some way too, which is the fun part. So for example, A Head Full of Ghosts, when I was first writing down the idea of a possession, it's no, it has to be 2 sisters. And the reason why, even if I didn't know why, eventually I would figure out, because, I want to comment on all the possession movies that have come beforehand and that have, over-sexualized 14-year-old girls, et cetera. I wanted to, make some gender commentary. So it had to be 2 sisters. With Disappearance at Devil's Rock, I decided early that I wanted to be a single mother. I knew I was going to do a family again, but I wanted sort of not the same family that I had in the first book. I wanted a different kind of family. And the same thing with Cabin at the End of the World. That book was going to be my 7th novel. The people who first read my stories were my cousin Michael and his husband Rob, and my Aunt Mary and her wife Debbie. And part of choosing the couple of that book was, one, I wanted again to have a different family represented, but also it felt weird, like this was a big deal. This is my 7th novel. I wanted to honor, the people who I love and have really helped me with my writing from, the first day. So when I make those choices, those obviously inform the story. All right. So that was a long answer. There was a couple other things though. So who do I write for? I write for myself first and foremost, but I'm in a very privileged position to have book deals. So, there's that side of it. I realize, okay, people are paying me money and they're expecting something from me. But honestly, I really try to put that as far out of my head as possible when I can. And I really sort of try to rely on the idea that I trust that there are enough readers who feel like I do. And actually, I think Kazu Ishihiro, I don't think I'm saying his name right, the guy who wrote Never Let Me Go, and most recently Clara and the Sun, he talked about, for him, writing and reading was oh, you see the same things I do, or you feel the same way. And to me, that's sort of the magic of story. And, just getting to a point where I trust, if I do a good enough job, that there are going to be enough readers who are like me. It doesn't mean to say that they're all going to be 6'4" and goofy looking. There are enough readers who think and see the world in a similar way that I do, but also different too. And that's the fun part, is everyone bringing their own experience to the story, changes it and informs it. So I will say I definitely don't write with an audience in mind, though, other than myself, because I think that's too hard. It's hard enough writing a good story. I can't imagine, I've had some people say, oh, I definitely write with an audience in mind, and I'm trying to scare these certain people. It's well, you're better than I am. That's way too much pressure. I have a hard enough time writing for myself. I can't imagine writing for a whole set of other people. And as far as when am I done? Or how do I know if it if this is has a Tremblay story or something like that? I honestly spend more time trying to fool myself, because I'm at this certain point where I've written a bunch of stories and a bunch of novels. I'm trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to fool myself into thinking that, oh, this is going to be totally different than the one I did before. And I try to make things feel different by either buying a new notebook, or even just trying a slightly different approach with each story. So it's a weird balance for me. I'm trying to make it feel different, so it feels exciting. But at the same time, I still want to be able to lean on prior experience and be okay, I've done it before. When I'm about to quit, I can do it again. And that I want to quit point always happens at the 100-page mark. Every time. To me, that's the make or break. If I can get past page 100, then it's going to be a thing. Because I've had plenty of other things that have ended at 100 pages and I sort of gave up on them.
Thank you, Paul. I think Ramon wanted to say something.
Yes, it is very, very difficult to understand, but I know it's true that the horror literature that don't have any higher standard or not well recognized in the United States, because you in the States had a very rich history of great writers, Edgar Allan Poe, for instance, Ambrose Bierce, Chambers. Anyway, but in your case, there is something about Joyce Carol Oates in particular with that you feel that is important in your work, is a direct influence, or maybe there is another influence in Gothic literature, in Southern Gothic literature.
So for me, mean, that story helped sort of set me on the path to becoming a reader. But I mean, it's hard to deny that sort of the ubiquitousness of Stephen King is got to be one of the biggest influence, because even though I didn't read him until my 20s, you know, I'd seen almost all the movies that he'd put out. I mean, obviously in the 80s when I was a teen, Stephen King was such a large figure. And I know once I fell in love with reading, I tried to read, and I do read as widely as possible and outside of genre too. And I don't know, I always view myself as a magpie. Like every story is a nest that I'm taking little bits from everywhere that I can to build this new thing. So, I mean, I typically read about, I don't know, anywhere between 60 to 80 novels a year. It's kind of, you know, because I feel like if I'm not reading, my writing's going to suffer. I feel less smart when I'm not reading. Yeah, as far as like why horror is not respected more, I mean, in the US anyway, and I think it started in England and as well, just because it has similar academic setup. You know, when these, even the writers that you mentioned, like Bierce, et cetera, those were published by what they call the pulps, right? And the pulps literally referred to the type of paper, the cheap paper stock. You know, so in England first, you know, in the 1800s, like the pulp novels were produced for the factory workers. So they were considered, you know, by the academics to be, you know, of much lower standard compared to, you know, what was being read by the academics. And who are the academics? They were the ones who had enough money to pay for the privilege of education. And who taught them? You know, academics. And that sort of cycle just sort of, you know, continued. The next academics were the ones who, you know, were able to, you know, to pay to get their degree. And then, you know, for a long time, I think for most of the 20th century, that's the case. I mean, I think things are certainly getting better in terms of, you know, who gets to go to college in our, you know, in the United States. But I mean, that's just a long legacy to overcome, sort of that like ingrained sort of class stigma of genre fiction.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Sure.
Well, I have a question about another thing. We, beside horror or within horror, we are fans of Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft. So I know from a previous interview that you gave us that you're not a big fan of him, but like your friend Ler Baron, he's like being classified like in Lovecraftian horror or things like that, cosmic horror. And how do you feel about that Lovecraftian horror? Is a revival right now, or do you feel left aside because you don't write much about it? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, no. I mean, because I mean, horror is, to me, like I imagine it's such a large tent. You know, there's so much room for different types of horror stories. You know, so for me, it's like I never really found Lovecraft when I was going through my early reading phase. And when I did, like I just had a hard time connecting with the prose. You know, it was just really sort of dense, and for whatever reason, like it, you know, I couldn't break through it. But, you know, the cool thing for me has been like, I've certainly been exposed to a ton of Lovecraft, but it's been through the writers of now, like Laird Barron and Livia Llewellyn and Victor Laval and Nathan Ballingrud and John Langan, et cetera. So here are all these people who have done sort of Lovecraftian or you know, in a bigger scope, which is called cosmic horror. So to me, that's sort of been the exciting part is, I get to see, you know, what my contemporaries have done with, you know, with this, you know, the famous literature. I think that's sort of like the advantage of being in horror too, is, you know, so we've got this genre with a long tradition. It's like, why not take advantage of that? So what I mean by that is like, why not engage in conversation with the things that have gone before you? You know, it's totally what, you know, A Head Full of Ghosts is, right? And maybe if you do a good enough job, not only do you get to engage with what happened before, maybe, you know, your thing puts a slightly different light on what happened before too. So, I mean, that's what I love about the horror genre is like, I get to join into this, you know, over a century plus, you know, almost 2 century plus conversation.
Well, something, I mean, you live right now in Boston, right? Like, but you are from the Southwest, I believe. I mean, I'm the journalist, sorry. I'm the one who always look for people.
Yeah, I mean, I was born in Colorado, but my dad was in the Air Force and we moved to New England when I was less than a year old. So I've ever since I've lived in New England, whether it's in Boston or Vermont. So, I went to school in Providence actually for 4 years. So yeah, I've always been in New England pretty much.
So you are a Bostonian, a New Englander.
Yes.
I wanted to ask, what is the regular sports life of Paul Tremblay? Did you watch the Olympics? Do you follow the local teams, the Patriots, the Red Sox, that tonight, by the way, they are playing against Baltimore Orioles?
Yes.
You like the Revolution, you like the soccer team, the Celtics. You have everything in there.
Yeah. No, I'm a big sports fan. I don't talk about it much on social media because it's like, not many. I feel like not many of my horror writing friends, if any, are into sports at all. But no, I love sports. That's pretty much like sort of what I watch if I'm not reading or stuff like that. So yeah, grew up a huge Red Sox fan. I wanted to be Larry Bird of the Boston Celtics when I was a kid. I did watch much of the Olympics. So yeah, like I consume, like, even in the afternoon, when I'm doing my workout, which is not a crazy workout, I'm listening to sports talk radio, which is really big in this area because Boston's kind of a crazy sports town. Like, they're really into sports here. My family growing up are all into sports. My daughter is actually a really good soccer player, so I've come to love soccer through her. It's been really cool. So I do watch like a lot of Premier League soccer now. Yeah, so I like sports.
And another thing about the Bostonian people, like what we get here in Mexico usually are movies. We learn a little bit from every place in the United States. I mean, you learn from California, you learn from Florida, how's the culture. But what we usually get here are the movies Scorsese, Mark Wahlberg, Leonardo DiCaprio, all these gangs, all these police movies. Did you have this kind of environment growing up in Boston?
Yeah, so for me, like I remember like pre-cable television or pre-pay television, so I mentioned Creature Double Feature. While I was like 7 or 8 years old, we had, 2 knobs on our TVs. One was for the regular channels and the one was like the UHF you really had to turn. And that's where Creature Double Feature would be. But then when we got cable, that was me in the 1980s. Like, HBO was a new thing. So I came home and we just watched HBO all the time. My younger brother, he's younger than me by 5 years, is also a huge horror fan. And he's much more sort of hardcore gorehound kind of horror fan. Like, even as a kid, like when he was 10, he was watching Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I think I watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the first time like 5 years ago. So it's funny, like, as the older brother, like I remember taking him out of the room during Poltergeist, the scene where the guy tears his face off. I was like, come on, Dan, you can't watch this. But it was really because I didn't want to watch it. I need an excuse, to go away from the scene. Oh man, I don't even know if I answered the question. Oh, movies. Yeah. So yeah, for me, movies was sort of what I was reared on, before I started reading. And, so it was a lot of horror movies, but it was also just movies in general. Yeah.
But you never got yourself into this culture that we perceive from Boston, like all either you're a police officer or a gangster or something like that. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I lived in a suburb. So I lived in a town called Beverly, which is actually right next to Salem, Mass, which is, famous for its witch trials. So Salem's sort of a strange city. So there's like the older part of the city, which really sort of weirdly celebrates the Salem witch trials, which is kind of weird to think because, 19 people died horribly. And then there are parts of the city that are really sort of blighted, like almost like an urban blight. It's a really schizophrenic, strange city. And my father worked at a toy factory in Salem. Parker Brothers. Parker Brothers used to make Monopoly, but Hasbro bought them out. So yeah, I mean, so my very suburban upbringing was, my father worked in the factory, my mother was a bank teller. I was a very small, skinny, and shy kid, so I definitely had no gangster dreams or no cop dreams for sure. And at that point, my only experience with Boston was going in to see Red Sox games, or visiting my aunt. Yeah, I have more of a Boston accent. I sound like I have an accent anyway, but I get a thicker Boston accent if I've been drinking. But I've been good tonight. but I've been good tonight, so I haven't been drinking.
Related to that, your first novel was The Little Sleep. It's about a detective, right? So
Yes.
was it like a Bostonian influence there or not related?
Yeah, for sure. So like the funny part with that book was the initial idea that I had was a stereotypical private detective sort of scene where a beautiful woman walks into a detective's office. But the weird part was the woman holds up her hand and she's got bandages at the bases of her fingers. And she says, "Someone stole my fingers and replaced them with someone else's. I need you to find them." So when I first had that idea, I was like, I was going to try to play it like her fingers really were missing and do like a weird science fiction Philip K. Dick kind of story. But nothing really worked. So I put away like that chapter for almost a year. And then I happened to be like researching medical stuff for another story. And I came across narcolepsy. In the symptoms of narcolepsy, what I knew of narcolepsy was, people fall asleep. But like when I read more, it was like, I had no idea that they have these wild hypnagogic hallucinations and other things. So that weird detective chapter is like, he's asleep, he's dreaming. So once I started with that, what I wanted to do was try to subvert everything that people assume about Boston, because it takes place in South Boston. The detective is Lithuanian, he's not Irish. And that's actually really reflected by my wife, Lisa. Her mother's side of the family all grew up in South Boston, and they're all Lithuanians. So like when I go to South Boston, like we go to the Lithuanian club, or, funerals have been at the Lithuanian St. Peter's Church and stuff like that. So I wanted to mess with like the Donnie Wahlberg, vision of the Departed of Boston, like, show sort of a different side with my sort of quirky detective.
That's amazing. Okay, Pepe,
Yeah.
you there, right?
Yeah. Here in the Circle, we usually read short stories. Every single week, we read a couple, 3 or 4 short stories. One of the most usual comments when we are like reading and talking about a short story is like, this is so condensed. This one should be a novel. Mm. Have you ever feel a regret in leaving a short story in that length? I mean, what do you like to write more, like novels or short stories?
That's a good question. I don't think I've ever had like, I wrote a short story. It's like, you know what? It has to be a novel. For whatever reason, and I've never done the opposite either. Like sit down and write a novel, like, oh no, this is really a short story. To me, like they're two totally different mindsets. When I first started writing, it was all short stories. And, then I felt like I had to learn how to write a novel. Like The Little Sleep was my first novel that I sold, but it was like the 4th and a half that I had written. One older one eventually, got published by a small publisher. But anyway, I will say there's one short story that I've always tried to expand, and I haven't been able to do it. It's called The Getaway. Sort of a crime horror hybrid that's in Growing Things. I've been messing around with a couple of filmmaking friends. We're trying to write like a treatment to try to expand that short story into like a movie length thing. I take that back. I guess the closest, I took a really old short story that I wrote like in 2001 or 2002 called The Harlequin in the Train. That existed as like a 4,000 word short story first. Again, I tried writing a screenplay version of it, and it was terrible as a screenplay, but I liked what I added, so I ended up writing it as a novella. So I expanded to like 36,000 words, not quite a novel, but almost. But really, that's the only time I've messed around with the length like that. Yeah, I don't know. Like for me, short stories are almost like I'm writing like a scene, even though multiple scenes happen. I feel like it's just like, as you described, as this compact thing, which is not to say it can't be expansive. I mean, that's sort of the cool part of a short story. It can still be like this really almost like eternal thing, but in a much, smaller form. Whereas the novel, obviously, you get to expand and mess around a lot more.
Thank you.
Bram, you there?
We have discussed the options for the channels for telling a story, about the length, about Netflix, or about movies. But are you interested, or have you considered to write something for a different media, like a video game, or like a web comic, or like a stage plays, something like that, something you haven't done yet? You will want to explore, like something like you need to read as a WhatsApp format, tapping the cell phone to read the conversation, something like that?
Yeah, well, so for one, like I often try to incorporate, so the WhatsApp idea. I try to incorporate, especially my short fiction, different modes of narratives. Like in Growing Things, there's a novella called Notes from the Dog Walkers, where the story is told by notes left by a dog walker. I did another story where it was told through 19 pictures, so it was a description. So I'm definitely attracted to, you just mentioned using like WhatsApp or like as a way of writing a story. I have no idea how to do it. Like I've never done it, never studied it, but I would love to write a comic. I think that would be kind of fun. John Langan and I have sort of talked about writing a comic together at some point, but if we can ever find the time or the shared time to do so. Otherwise, I mean, the hard part is, I wouldn't be so, wouldn't be so arrogant to think that, I could just switch to another form without like really studying it and putting in the work. And that includes screenplays. I've been messing around with screenplays, but I don't really know, what the hell I'm doing. It's much different than, writing a short story or writing a novel. So that's been sort of what's held me back, just because there's only so many hours in a day, especially once, the teaching kicks in, Excuse me.
Thank you.
Oh, well, we have a question from the public at YouTube. Francisco Juarez says, what do you think of the combination of science fiction and horror? And would you ever dare to write this combination?
I love it. I mean, especially, if we keep coming back to movies, I mean, obviously Alien is like one of my favorite movies. The Thing. I'm trying to think. I've written in short stories. I've done the science fiction horror thing, but I guess I really haven't done it in a novel. I'm trying to figure out, and actually I've been asking John, we've been talking, we help each other with ideas sometimes. I have a goal of wanting to write like a giant monster novel or a kaiju novel. So that would definitely lean more towards like science fictional horror, just to, is to come up a way with a somewhat almost plausible way as to why there's a giant monster in the story, kind of thing. So I think maybe the next one, we'll see. Otherwise, man, I'm trying to think. Yeah, no, the novels have been pretty much no science. But I do really enjoy it. I enjoy really any mashup of horror with any other genre, whether it be, horror and Western or, horror and literary fiction, etc.
As Bram says here, we have an exclusive. This is exclusive for Círculo Lovecraftiano.
Yes.
Brought it to you. I was gonna say, like, when I read your books, John Langan's books, especially. I mean, because from what we call the three horsemen of the apocalypse, you did one more. I don't know if there's another one, but the three of you are kind of in this line. But Laird Barron goes more to the folk, this kind of old-fashioned stuff. But you two go to the regular everyday life, and it could be considered the most transgressive things nowadays, putting kids in danger and stuff like that. And I was just remembering 40 years ago, I mean, it's been 40 years since the movie Airplane came out. And I was talking about this earlier, how the scenes in Airplane, many of the things you saw there couldn't be told, couldn't be shoot now.
Right.
They're like the scene, Captain Overdue, or I don't remember, Peter Graves was the captain talking uglily to the kids.
Yeah.
You know, a little bit of pedophilia comments in a family movie, and all these Jewish jokes, all these hitting women jokes. Do you think we are living a kind of dangerous time when you can write something that you could be canceled for?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd say dangerous, but I'd also be lying to you if I didn't sort of worry about that, or think about that. I shouldn't say worry necessarily, but sure. I mean, the questions of, you know, what should be written, what shouldn't be written, and you know, so granted, you know, I'm a, you know, middle-aged, you know, cishet male, you know, with lots of privilege. So, you know, you can take my answers with a grain of salt. But, you know, when I've talked to other writers, particularly, you know, writers of color or writers, you know, from another gender, et cetera, you know, I feel like in those conversations, they present to me as like, if you're thinking about it, that's really like half the battle, like as opposed to just like wading in and not like caring. But I don't know, it's a balance. Like, I do like the idea of like stories. I would never want stories to fit sort of like, have to fit like a box where they're all sort of like moral stories. Like, no, like it's representing like, this is what it should be. And these people are good. This is how good people talk. I think, you know, stories should be what they are. Stories can be like messy, ugly, little weird things. You know, I still think that's the case. I haven't seen, you know, I don't think we're in danger of that happening to stories. I mean, if it gets to that point, then I would be a lot more worried. But like, you know, for example, I just read, you know, Megan Abbott is sort of crime. Like she writes dark fiction. I don't know if you were aware of Megan Abbott, but she's wrote a novel called The Turnout. And man, there's some messed up stuff happening in that book. You know, and it's a bestseller. And, you know, maybe if a man wrote it, like people might look at it more as cancelly, but I don't know. I don't think so. But anyway, like I'm just giving you an example of a story that like, you know, that still pushes that boundary. So I guess I'm really talking all around that. Like I still hope that stories will continue to push up boundaries. But it's hard to answer, you know, frankly, like, you know, with Cam at the End of the World, you know, I wrote about a gay couple that adopted a Chinese little girl, and I'm neither of those things or none of those things. I feel like it's okay. You know, again, some people might disagree with me, which is fine, but I feel like it's okay for me to do that as long as I treat those characters with respect. And also as long as if I'm not writing about what it feels like to be in their culture, right? I'm not writing a story about gay culture. I'm writing a story where there were two gay men in it. To me, I think that would be out of bounds for me. Like, you know, I should not be writing about gay culture, but I can write a story with gay characters. If that makes sense.
It makes sense because we are living these times, but let's just pretend for a second we have this pandemic. It's about zombies. Who would survive between you, John, Laird, or Sarah Langan?
Oh, that's a great. I think Sarah, no doubt. Sarah is very smart and savvy. You know, and she has like degrees in like ecological stuff too. Like she has a very specific odd degree that involves like ecology and chemicals or something. So I'm sure by far, she would last the longest. John would be too friendly and try to save people. So that would be his downfall. I think Laird would be, he would try to fight too many things. He would get in trouble. I would probably just be cowering in the corner. Yeah, and I'm too tall. Like, people would grab the tall guy, I think.
Have you ever go jogging with John Langan?
Jogging? No. Yeah, we haven't done many sporting things together. Once I went and visited his family. He was up in Massachusetts. A friend of his loaned them their house that was close to a beach. So there was one time where John, myself, and our kids played beach soccer. That's the closest that we've come to any sort of running.
Dr. Psychopomp said beer sports.
John doesn't he's a Scotch drinker. No beer for him. The only time I've ever seen him, he told me, he's like, oh, I drink beer, I get like angry, and I didn't believe him. And it was true. I saw him drink it once. It's like, wow, stick to Scotch. Yeah, I love beer. As I'm getting older, I wish beer loved me more. But no, I do like Scotch too, but I do like beer.
And you like a specific kind of beer? You like craft beer or regular Milwaukee or whatever?
I kind of like all over the place. But typically I do like craft beer. Like, I don't like the major US ones like Bud or Bud Light, or that stuff's trash. But I like wheat style beers or wit beers. Those are really nice. Excuse me. I've, for the first time ever, just started drinking porters or stouts. I never used to like them because they tasted too much like coffee to me. I don't like coffee. I will have a Corona with a lime in it. I like cerveza style beers. Modelo, actually, yeah, I do like Modelo quite a bit. Negro Modelo is a good one. Yeah.
And then a specific brand you like? Because Santiago and I, we love craft beer too. So I love stouts, and Santiago loves IPAs. So which one do you recommend from your area?
It's funny. I mean, it's I think it's probably everywhere now, but there's so much beer being made here. So it's like half the time I'm just like, I grab a can just because it looks interesting. But my current favorite is Allagash, is a brewery in Maine. And Allagash White is my sort of favorite wheat style beer. Yeah, that's really good. That's sort of my go-to. Yeah, otherwise, like if you're looking for an IPA, I like Long Trail Ale is from Vermont. That's a really good one.
You don't, as you mentioned a little while ago, you do not have this Bostonian. I was expecting, because I have never heard you. I read a lot of interviews of you, but I've never heard you speaking. So I was expecting the Bostonian accent, like when I say Bostonians do not pronounce the last R.
Right.
Like, where's my call? Or parking lot.
Yeah. Or so in the new novel I just finished, the main character names himself Art Barbara, partly because that name is so absurd in a Boston accent. It would be, Art Barbara. That's a little Boston accent there. Otherwise, just a lot of swearing.
Have you ever been teased because of your accent, or somebody, whenever you travel for a book showing or something, like you talk like from New England or some sort of?
Yeah, that doesn't happen very often, unless I'm forgetting it. I don't know. Yeah, I honestly don't get it too often. I mean, I think if I visited the South, I'd probably get it more. Because I think I would stand out even without a Boston accent. I wouldn't sound like a Southerner. But I haven't had very many events down there. I'm not sure why. No. Yeah. No, it's funny. Like my wife will make fun of me. She's like, I don't have an accent. She's like, yeah, you do. Like, oh, no one tells me I do. But I don't know.
Everyone says they don't have an accent.
Right. Well, like if I'm on the phone with my brother, who I've mentioned, super thick Boston accent. My mother, because my mother actually grew up in inner city Boston. So, she has a very thick accent. And so half the time I'm on the phone with her, I'm just sort of repeating her own words back to her because it's, all the long A sounds,
That is amazing. I think we're gonna close the live session. We're gonna.
I
Javier.
have just a final question. This is a really weird question, man.
Okay.
Probably you had it tons of times before, but when I read A Head Full of Ghosts, and not exactly the story, which is great, but the way you wrote it, the way that you wrote it in a 3 point of views, basically, I thought to myself, why I never thought about this, man? This is amazing. Have you ever thought that? I mean, when you read something and said, I should have done this. It's just like, or maybe you read something and said, I can do this. I should have done this. I don't know, something along the lines of this. I had this idea in my head, but I just couldn't blurt it out, something like that.
Oh, absolutely. But typically what I end up doing is like, I want to try that somehow, like, a totally different story. But my friend Seth Lindbergh wrote a story called like 23 Snapshots of San Francisco, I think it was called. It's a zombie story told through 23 photographs. Like, oh man, I want to do that someday. And I asked for his permission if it was okay if I did it. So I ended up writing a story called 19 Snapshots of Dennisport. With Survivor Song, the novel that came out last summer, without getting too spoilery, there's an interlude, toward like maybe the 2/3, 3/4 part of the book. There's an interlude where the whole book is about two characters, Romola and Natalie, but the book breaks briefly for this interlude for two other characters. And that was definitely inspired by a literary writer named Patrick DeWitt. He wrote a book called, I'm going to type it out in the chat, Major Domo Minor. M-A-R, I can't spell M-A-R. Oops. Patrick DeWitt. Anyway, so the book is really told from the point of view of this one character, but there's this interlude in the middle of that book that's really heartbreaking, but also very sweet and beautiful. It's like, oh man, I want to try to do that someday. So, and I put that away in the back of my head because it was years later that I figured, okay, maybe I could do this a little bit in, in Survivor Song. So yeah, like I earlier had said, I'm a magpie. Like I try to take things. I think all writers have to do that. Like, and then you just trust, first take a breath and realize everything has been done before in some way. What's different is you, right? There hasn't been a you before you. And the hard part is, how does that come out in your writing? And it took me, at least 15 years or so to start figuring out, how to do that. Right. And that's the trust thing again, where you trust there's enough readers who think like you do or feel like you do out there as well.
Thanks,
Giovanni Arriaga, he has a question. It's very interesting because sometimes we don't get, unfortunately, but you go ahead, please, Giovanni.
Thank you. Hi, Paul.
Hi.
I have a question. It's about the place where you born. You grew up in Boston, but there are so many authors that actually born or grew up in Boston. You have Lovecraft, he's from Rhode Island. You have Poe, he's from Boston. You have Stephen King and Joe Hill from Maine. And as I said, you actually from Boston. Do you think that there is something special, something in the air, I don't know, something in this place in general, in New England area? Why there are so many great authors of horror that grew up in this specific place of North America?
Well, I think, some of it almost becomes like self-perpetuating just because, starting with Poe, there are so many creepy tales set in New England. It almost becomes like a default setting for a horror story in some ways. And so right off the bat, like you have readers imagining this and, just even growing up, like, even if you weren't reading it, it's everywhere. There are so many, these odd folk tales, ghost stories. There are a lot of old houses, old for the United States, old houses in Massachusetts and New England. So there's always, it's just part of the culture of the spooky vibe. The Puritan thing still sort of hangs over a lot of Massachusetts too. The sort of the infatuation with evil and the devil, in religion, sort of in this weird way, to the point where I remember we still have what were called blue laws that, even though we supposedly have separation of church and state, there were these old laws that were there because of religion, because of the Puritans. For decades and decades, people in Massachusetts weren't allowed to buy alcohol on Sundays because of old Puritan laws. I mean, that, within the last 15 years, that's been removed. But, just even like little things like that. I don't know. And I think people sort of, in this area have a natural, I don't want to say fear of nature, but you can, even though it's a pretty densely populated area, there are mountains, there are forests, places you can go hiking into the woods. And that always just gets me thinking of, the old folktales of New England. So for me as a writer, I think, if anything I set in New England, a reader is going to bring their own expectations. And I can either use that to my advantage or undermine it or tweak with or play with it. So I think it's less about sort of the, any specialness of the place than other than just the reputation and using it, using it to your advantage.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Morgan is gonna tell us a little bit of announcement for, we are on the weekend of Lovecraft anniversary, so please go ahead, Morgan.
Yes, thank you. This is in Spanish, sorry. Recuerden que tenemos el evento de la Ciudad de las Montañas de la Locura, empezando el jueves 19. Vamos a empezar con algo de rol. Tenemos invitados de Ciudad de México, de Monterrey, de muchos lados. El viernes tenemos 3 pláticas sobre Lovecraft y ser anacrónico, sobre Carcosa, la ciudad perdida, sobre... ¿qué más? Vamos a hablar con el abuelo Kraken, no se lo pierdan. Y el sábado, que es para cerrar, empezamos con La casa en el confín, después seguimos con Sangre y sexo, una plática de gore y horror erótico con escritoras de Perú, Colombia, tenemos de España, esperen esa muy ansiosos, y después un panel de Lovecraft con grupos de Perú, de Ecuador, de Bolivia, perdón, y el Círculo de Puebla y nuestro Círculo, así que va a estar genial, los esperamos desde las 6 de la tarde, jueves, viernes y sábado.
Thank you, Morgan. Did you get any of those words, Paul?
No, it's one of my great regrets in life that I don't know a second language, and I foolishly took French in high school.
We all did, I guess. Okay, we are going to finish the live transmission for YouTube, Discord, and any other thing we have open in live. We're going to stay a little bit more with Paul Tremblay here in the Zoom. Thank you, everyone who joined us tonight. Thank you, Paul. Any last word for anyone who was here?
Oh, no, thank you. This is, great questions and a lot of fun. Yeah, keep reading horror.
Thank you very much, guys. Everyone who saw this live. See you next Friday. See you next Thursday.